In this video, I want to demonstrate the emerging two-tier system in Western society, particularly in the United States, and why it could end in the loss of everything we know. The politicization of the justice system is just the start of it. With all the other institutions following, there is a sense of an unbridgeable divide emerging on both sides already. Biden started out as a presidential candidate saying that he would work with everybody. Instead, in just over 100 days, the political divide between the left and right seems to be rapidly growing. He now accuses the previous administration of politicizing the Department of Justice, the DOJ. But maybe it had slipped his mind that only a few days before, while the jury was still deliberating on the Chauvin trial, that he had come out and said this.
I'm praying the verdict is the right verdict, which is, I think it's overwhelming in my view. I wouldn't say that unless the jury was sequestered now. Not hear me say that.
The problem is, of course, the jury hadn't made a decision at that point when Biden made that comment, nor had the judge demanded a media blackout. So they would have heard his remarks if they hadn't have come to a decision so quickly on three serious accounts. Biden seemingly does not see or chooses to ignore the rules he wants to apply to the other side. And that's not to mention the problematic nature of the trial itself, the threat of violence surrounding it, and the seemingly lack of impartiality of the justice system, which just kicked the can down the road so that the violence will resume when the verdict is overturned, because the lawyers are already talking about a retrial. Ben Shapiro had a guest lawyer on, and they referenced the problems with the trial and the grounds for appeal in this video. But Biden has since gone on to say this.
This last administration politicized the Justice Department so badly. So many of them quit. So many left because that's not the role. It's not the role of a president to say who should be prosecuted, when they should be prosecuted, who should be not prosecuted. That's not the role of the president. The Justice Department is the people's lawyer, not the president's lawyer.
Maybe he had forgotten that during the Obama administration, in which he was VP, the head of the DOJ, Eric Holder, had touted himself as the president's wingman. So it was already politicized. So the question should be instead, to what extent has the justice system, intelligence community become politicized and weaponized? The evidence suggests that the political world might have done a full about-face, and now we might be living through a 21st century version of McCarthyism, in which now the left-wing government goes hunting for phantom enemies. For a long time now, there have been politically motivated raids, trials, and stories leaked that were later retracted about Trump and his associates that never culminated in anything actually substantial, but dragged the person long enough through the mud to do enough political damage, which was the point in the first place anyway. For example, the FBI investigation of Rudy Giuliani smacks of partisanship. The investigation was launched under Barr, which some suggest disproves that, but that didn't stop the investigators and leaks during the last presidency. Within hours, parts of the story have already been shown to be false. So we'll see. And likewise, there is a laundry list of Trump associates who have been raided or charged over the last few years, which Dan Bongino goes through, and with each fresh allegation being collusion with Russia or the Ukraine in one form or another. But always the story is discredited much later, but by then the damage has already been done. So whether Biden knew or not is immaterial. He likely didn't want to know, so he had plausible deniability anyway. But enough people knew, like the anti-Trump Lincoln Project, to show that it was clearly politically motivated. The intelligence community seems to be acting independently, but rather politically motivated. Obama's wingman, after all, Eric Holder, had urged them all to wait out the Trump administration. This lawfare is not just restricted to Trump's associates. Some of the January 6th Capitol Hill rioters were in solitary confinement for over a month without even being charged, to the point that even Democrats were raising concerns. Those people who stormed the Capitol had no weapons, and while stupid, it's no different from the attacks on the federal buildings all last year by Black Lives Matter and Antifa in Portland, Seattle. Yet in the vast majority of cases, they were released without any punishment. On the rare occasions they were actually caught. With political prisoners getting the harshest of treatment, even if only trial and ostracism from the public square, are we not mimicking the actions of the Soviet Union, in which the jails are filled with political prisoners and the criminals were let out and ended up being the prison guards, as per Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago? The latest is that Biden is considering outsourcing surveillance to big tech so that they are not restricted by the Constitution when surveilling American citizens. We only need to consider the recent example of the Soviet Union to see where it will end up. This lawfare is not only restricted to the English-speaking world. In France, Marine Le Pen has just been acquitted for posting Islamic State pictures 6 years ago, and she faced up to 3 years in jail. So as Solzhenitsyn wrote, it should be fear of the law, not the judge. Also, there's been a purging of the military, which began straight after Biden's inauguration, with a witch hunt for supposed white supremacists in the National Guard who were around the White House at the time, with the removal of anybody deemed a threat, including for suspect text messages, without ever explaining what those messages actually said. With now the Pentagon are saying they're intensifying their efforts to combat this white supremacy. So where does this end? The Soviet Union also had many military purges, searching out wrongthink, culminating in the biggest in 1937 by Stalin, which left him and his country completely defenseless against the invasion in 1941. Now, in the UK, it is even considered exclusionary and therefore hateful to quote Genesis in the Bible and talk about the sanctity of marriage between a man and a woman, and the police play along. They are becoming politicised and non-conformers are being purged. Recently in the US, 2 cops have been suspended for saying something that likely the majority of the country agree with. This politicisation of the police in Western English-speaking countries has taken on a totalitarian inclination, and it's scary. After the last US presidential election, there was a shutdown of anyone who questioned its integrity. Yet any efforts to increase voter integrity and therefore confidence in the system, such as in Georgia, have been met with claims of racism, with major corporations boycotting the state, which have only ended up hurting the people they were claiming to be standing for. But it's only further eroded the public trust in the electoral system. But now compare that to the obfuscation on the left. For most of last year, there was the downplaying of the Black Lives Matter and Antifa riots by the Democrats and the media and big tech, with political violence or the threat of it becoming an acceptable means for many on the ideological left. And then there are the politicians who are not held to account for their actions. There were many, of course, Democrats who were caught, like Nancy Pelosi and Gavin Newsom, flouting the laws that they supposedly backed. Then there are other left-wing politicians like Australian Daniel Andrews and New York's Mayor Andrew Cuomo, whose decisions may have led to the death of thousands during this COVID pandemic, but they remain largely unscathed by the law and by most of the media, yet remain in power with this pandemic far from over. They just both obfuscated until the story was eventually buried and the news cycle had moved on, and have shown the way for many to follow and have a law unto themselves. And then there is Hunter Biden, who had federal agents outside his door while he was doing crack cocaine with hookers and possibly minors, who also lied about his drug addiction to get a gun and then allegedly lied again to get it back, but faced no consequences, of course, despite an investigation, and clearly the agents knew about a lot of it. Even worse, the intelligence community covered up for him. Not to mention the Democrat-aligned press and big tech, who both buried the story when it came out. The CIA's latest intersectionality-based advert demonstrates how far the intelligence community's focus has switched to the ideologically aligned far left, which maybe possibly explains why they turned a blind eye to Hunter's illegal activity or any evidence of it. All this at the same time while his father is pushing gun laws with his so-called red flag laws to crack down on cases like that of his son. Biden is also now considering other extreme measures like stacking the Supreme Court to give it a perpetual one-sided majority, also giving statehood to Washington DC and Puerto Rico to ensure a Democratic majority in the Senate. Does anyone think the law is even close to being applied fairly? Can anyone claim with a straight face that Lady Justice is still blind in the Western world? When the Department of Justice and the intelligence community appear to be the Democrat lawyer, media their judge, and the big tech their executioner, does that not contradict everything that Biden says? This two-ruler system applies to illegal immigrants who get across the border. They no longer need ID to fly. They can vote. And if they get to New York, they're given $15,000. None of which are available to citizens. This two-rule system is also being applied in Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom, becoming transparent with the allowing of BLM marches in 2020 during the COVID pandemic, and in some cases allowing murals to be painted in public streets. Yet at the same time, any anti-lockdown marches were met with the full force of the state. Take, for instance, the example of the left-wing government's approach in Victoria, Australia. On the one hand, this was the approach to the BLM marches taking place during the pandemic in 2020.
It will be very difficult, if you end up with 6,000, 10,000 people there. Victoria Police won't be pulling people out and giving them infringements. It'll be impossible without that leading to violence. If you've got 10,000 people there, it's impossible to start doing infringements
Okay.
without it causing massive safety issues for police as well as for protesters and the broader communities.
Compare that to the attitude they took towards the anti-lockdown protests.
Selfish, unlawful, and wrong. Absolutely. It's not smart, it's not right, it's not lawful to be protesting. Now is not the time for protest. You know, no one has the right to make choices like that potentially puts at risk everything that everyone's given and everything that we're working towards.
Arresting pregnant women in their home for even daring to plan a demonstration, and any protests were crushed by lines of police. Everything in alignment with the interests of the far left government. Big tech also played their part by allowing hate speech on one side but calling anything they didn't like from the other hate speech and completely barring it. But wait a minute, you might say. Even if you might think this is all one big conspiracy theory against Biden, even if that were true, one thing that history teaches us is that even if something might not necessarily be true, if enough people believe it to be so, then it becomes, in a sense, reality anyway. So why does it seem like society is unravelling? Well, if John Searle is correct, society is built upon collective intentionality. We use linguistic representations for things like money. We assign a value to it, and then we all agree that it has that function in our society. Now, upon that, we expand and we build markets and stock exchanges and things like that. And gradually, as we go on, our society gets more and more complex. But if you go and make big changes and have one rule for some and another rule for the rest, it's going to erode trust in that system. And once that is gone, there's nothing else holding it all together. Already some have started talking about civil war. People are moving already into red or blue states, creating a 21st century version of the Mason-Dixon line. We need to learn from the mistakes of the past, not make them again. That's why history matters.